Chapter 5, How Ecosystems Work. Start off Chapter 5 by reviewing the article on Lake Washington's ecological imbalance. Basically, one example of how we use science to understand the environment, and that has to start with a basic understanding of ecology and a basic understanding of the terminology that relates to what is required for ecosystems to work. So we talked about environmental science, which is obviously the title of this class, and defined that term. So really the foundation of all science, whether it's environmental science, wildlife biology, forestry, any of that, is really that you have to have a basic but sound understanding of ecology. The term ecology was coined by Ernst Haeckel, and it's basically defined as the study of the interactions among living things, and between living things, and their non-living environment. So abiotic refers to the non-living part of the environment. So it's a combination of the living things as well as the non-living things. And just like environmental science, ecology is really a bigger picture study of not only plants and animals, but also how that relates to geology, chemistry, and physics. All right, so now that you know that ecology is basically studying the interactions between living things and their environment, we'll look at some of the different levels of organization with relation to ecology. Of course, we know we can study microscopic things, study the individual systems of animals and individual cells and how they work. But basically, ecologists study populations, communities, ecosystems, etc. So we'll define what each of those are since they're kind of the fundamental units of ecology. So populations are groups of organisms of the same species that live in the same place at the same time. So looking at this little tidal pool here, there's a little population of anemones, the green things. You see a population of those kind of reddish starfish. And then there are populations of other things. You can tell different species of plants and animals living in there. So again, populations are groups of organisms that live in the same place at the same time. The next level above that, so going from specifics like populations to broader things like communities. So within this photo, one tidal pool, it's a community because it's all the different populations of the two different kinds of starfish and the anemones and the other little things in there that all live and interact together within the same area. So again, this tidal pool would be a community that contains populations of all the different specific living things that are in it. We move to a broader overview, and now we're talking about ecosystems. So communities are the living things in an area interacting with each other. The ecosystem now throws in the interaction of those living things with their physical environment. So again, the physical environment are the abiotic or non-living parts of the environment. So the air, the water, the soil, the rocks, the minerals are all examples of the physical environment. Then we go broader and we look at a landscape, which is a region that includes several different interacting ecosystems. So now we go from one tidal pool that's a community to the broader area that's a ecosystem. And basically this we often look at as the study of landscapes, landscape ecology, which looks at how all the different ecosystems within a given region are connected or how they interact with each other, how they depend on each other. And then finally we might pull all the way out to the level of a biosphere, which is the layer of the earth that all the living things live in. So this would be basically the zone right near the earth where living things occur. And so again, we know that today, as humans, we have the ability to not only affect a population or a community of living things, but we can literally affect the entire biosphere with the types of activities that we do. Some other fundamental things that we have to understand in order to understand ecosystems and in order to understand how we relate to the environment and what we can do to help fix problems is really understanding the idea of energy. Energy flows through an ecosystem, and basically energy is defined as the ability to do work. We have two types of energy that are illustrated by this image of the archer. Potential energy is stored energy. So when she draws the bow back and she's holding the arrow, there's potential energy there. It becomes kinetic energy when she releases the string. That kinetic energy causes motion. It causes the arrow to move forward. Another way you could think of these two types of energy is you have a giant boulder up on the top of a cliff. It has potential to do work, right? It's up there. If it's just sitting there, it's potential energy. If something happens and the land breaks away and that boulder falls off the cliff, now it has kinetic energy. It can do work. It might transfer its energy to the ground below, or maybe there's a car down at the bottom of that cliff. That boulder transfers its energy to crushing that car. Another important part of this whole process of understanding energy is the study of energy and the way that it transforms from one form to another. And so this is called thermodynamics. In a few minutes, we're going to talk about food chains and food webs and feeding levels of the different plants and animals in the environment. A fundamental concept of the universe is energy. And for us to understand how ecosystems are built and to build on some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in the next chapters, we have to understand thermodynamics. So they're basically the first two laws of thermodynamics that are relevant to us understanding populations and communities of living things. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So what this means is that there is a constant amount of energy in the universe. When we had the Big Bang and the Earth and all the planets and stars and the universe was created, there is only a certain amount of energy out there. The key thing about the first law of thermodynamics is that although you can't create or destroy energy, it does, I should say, transform from one form to another. So, from the standpoint of studying ecology, you probably already know that green plants on this planet, like the ones pictured in the image, use the sun's energy via photosynthesis to convert that solar energy into chemical energy. Chemical energy in the form of things like glucose that we or other animals can then eat. We as animals don't have the ability to transform the sun's energy into food energy, but plants do. So again, the first law of thermodynamics, energy can't be created or destroyed, but it can change from one form to another, such as from solar energy to chemical energy. But keep in mind that it's always the same amount. It's just transformed. And then the other part of this is that the key idea here, when we think about that, there's a total amount of energy out there, but it can be transformed, is that it's all about the usable energy. Again, the total amount of energy is the same if we look at the image. If it's ordered into the shape of a ball versus if it's exploded out, those are both the exact same amount of energy. But as energy increases in entropy, meaning it becomes less organized, then it becomes less usable. So while the amount doesn't change, the amount of usable energy does decrease over time. And we can think of this simply as loss of heat. For example, us. We eat food to fuel our bodies. We're warm-blooded animals. So among other things, when we process the food we eat, some of the food that we eat is in a form that doesn't digest, like the cellulose on plant material. But the other really important thing is to maintain our body temperatures, we eat food, and in turn, that energy is lost as heat. So if we don't keep eating food to fuel our body, we eventually lose more heat than our body can generate, which would cause us to die. So all warm-blooded animals lose energy in the form of heat. So the way we quantify this or measure it is basically through the process of entropy, which we could maybe kind of equate to chaos. The universe is always tending towards going from being more organized to being less organized. Heat energy is less organized than the chemical energy that we take in our body in the form of food. So again, it's about the amount of usable energy. Once we lose heat to the environment, that heat isn't really a usable source of energy anymore. The meat that we ate, the lettuce we ate for dinner, that chemical energy that our bodies transform into muscle tissue, hair, fat, skin, and heat that's lost in the process. That heat, again, is energy that's become less and less organized, so it doesn't have any other use for the environment. Along with this is that there is no process in nature that is 100% efficient. So when that energy is being transformed from solar energy to chemical energy, a lot of the energy is lost in the process. And then when that chemical energy is being transformed into a different type of energy when we eat that plant, some of that energy is being incorporated into our body, but again, some of it is also being lost as heat. So it's not 100% efficient. When we put a gallon of gasoline in our car, the combustion of that gasoline is nowhere near 100% efficient. So some of that energy is lost out the tailpipe, some of it's lost as heat. So again, not 100% efficient. So how does this relate to us understanding the environment better? Well, we start looking at how energy actually flows through ecosystems. We can identify the basic components of an environment. We have producers, consumers, and decomposers that are categorized based on how they get their nutrition from the environment. So producers are the plants that basically take the sun's energy and through a fairly complex process are able to create organic molecules, which are basically, again, simple sugars, glucose molecules that make up living things. So these are the important part of the environment, because without plants, we as animals would have no way to harness the sun's energy. So these producers are then potential food for all other organisms that live on the planet, all other consumers that live on the planet. So plants, in general, are the most significant producers that live on the land. The ocean has producers that are microscopic organisms, those phytoplankton that I mentioned earlier. But on land, plants are the most significant producer. So then, what eats those plants? Well, obviously a lot of things do. Herbivores are a type of consumer that eat plants. So they're primary consumers because they're the first type of consumer that eats plants directly. And so they feed on the chemical energy that's stored in the plants that they browse on. So I mentioned that an example of a primary consumer might be a moose. We can have a number of levels of consumers in an ecosystem depending on how much energy is actually available. We can have secondary consumers, we can have tertiary consumers, we can have a variety of different levels of consumers just depending on how much food is available. So if a moose is eating plants for its food, what in the moose's habitat might eat the moose? Well, if you're not sure, typically where moose are, there are maybe two types of predators, grizzly bear or wolves, that might eat a moose. So the wolf or the grizzly bear would be a secondary consumer because it's eating the primary consumer, which is a moose. Are you aware of any animals that eat a wolf or a grizzly bear? Well, if we were to shoot one and eat it, then we would be a third or tertiary level consumer. But in the environment, basically, the wolf or the grizzly bear or mountain lions are all top carnivores, top predators. So they're the top of the food chain. Nothing eats them. So then how do those carnivores or consumers get circulated back into the nutrient cycle? Well, basically there are another category of living things that break down organic matter. We have detritivores, and the example on this slide is the crab, that basically eat organic material that's dead and decomposing, that builds up on the bottom of the ocean, in the case of the crab, or that organic material called detritus that would build up on the ground. As living things die and decompose, they are broken down in smaller and smaller pieces. So that small stuff left over from a living thing would be detritus. So how does detritus then get to being broken down? And that would be because of the decomposers. So we have a huge variety of decomposers. Literally, the decomposers are the bacteria and the fungi that break down the organic matter into the smallest stuff called detritus. But if you think about it, when an animal dies, for example, what's the first thing usually that'll start eating the dead animal? Well, you might have scavengers like coyotes. You might have vultures in an area. So they start breaking down the whole organism to smaller bits. Then you have flies that'll lay their larvae in the dead animal. The maggots will feed off of it, hatch to flies. So you kind of have a series of steps going from breaking down the whole body of a living thing to eventually where it's the microscopic bacteria that do the last little step to break down those organic molecules into the detritus that can then be used by plants for their nutrition so that they feed the next level of consumers, and that process just keeps going around in a circle. The living things eventually die, are fed on by detritivores and decomposers. That nutrient that's left is fertilizer, basically, that the plants live off of. The plants grow and start feeding the consumers again. So back to this idea of how energy flows through an ecosystem. Energy moves pretty much in one direction, as I mentioned before. It's always moving from a more concentrated to a less concentrated form. So on the image on the bottom, we start with the sun's energy, which is the starting point for most life on this planet. That is then utilized by plants, the primary producers. Then you have the second trophic level, which are the primary consumers that eat the plant, or in the case of this mouse, would eat maybe seeds off of a plant. Then you have potentially another trophic layer, in this case a secondary consumer, so a snake that might eat the mouse. And then if there's enough energy still, you might have another layer of another trophic level. In this case, it could be a tertiary consumer, a third level consumer like a hawk that might catch the snake and eat it. And then if basically you've sort of run out of energy to feed another trophic level, excuse me, then those decomposers kick in, and when that hawk dies, basically they are what recycles it back so that there are nutrients in the soil for the next generation of producers to grow. So energy flows one direction through an ecosystem, creating these food chains. Each trophic level is part of a food chain. So the producers is a trophic level, the primary consumer is a second trophic level, the secondary consumer is a third trophic level, and so on to the decomposers, which are another trophic level. And all along the way, notice that some energy is being lost as heat, which again is less concentrated, so it has less ability to do work. So again, what limits how many links there can be in a food chain is basically the amount of energy. Less energy is available each step as you go from a producer to a consumer. In very productive ecosystems like tropical rainforests, there can be a lot of trophic levels because there's a lot of energy available in all of the diversity that we have in an ecosystem like that. Compare that to an ecosystem like a tundra. Remember we said very cold, not as productive because the seasons aren't very long. There's not a lot of different plants that live in those really cold climates. So if you're already starting off with far less plants, less sunlight in the environment, you might only have one level of a consumer. You might have lichen that are consumed by caribou. You might have another consumer like a wolf, but you're not going to have nearly as many trophic levels in a tundra as you would in any of the other biomes. But certainly the tropical rainforest is going to be the most productive terrestrial biome, and the estuaries are going to be the most productive aquatic biomes. So those are the biomes that can have the longest food chains. So as you start looking at all these individual food chains that you can find within an ecosystem, when you start putting them all together, like this image, you start creating a food web, which is all of the interconnected chains in an ecosystem. So we have something like a deciduous forest here on this image. You can see there are a variety of plants, several species of trees. There are some shrubs that have berries or fruits on them, grasses. So all of those plants then are going to feed the primary consumers. So you can see you've got birds, and butterflies, and rabbits, and spiders, and insects that are all going to be eating the vegetation directly, as well as the deer or whatever that might be in the background there, number 8. And then what eats those things? Well, the hawk, well, I guess we don't have a hawk on there, do we? We have an owl. So the owl is going to eat more than one kind of food. It might eat the mice. It might eat some of the other small mammals like the rabbit. It might eat some of the other bird species, just depending on what kind of hunter it is. You have foxes that'll eat a variety of different things. So if you start looking at all these connections, a given connection can fit into a food chain in a lot of different ways. Again, if the owl only ate one specific type of mouse, and that mouse only ate one specific type of seed off of a grass, that would be one food chain. But given that the owl is going to eat other things, it can generate several food chains of its own. And so even with this really simple little ecosystem here, you can see a lot of arrows going a lot of different directions. Even this is a very, very simplified ecosystem. It only depicts, like 4 bird species I see, maybe 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bird species. There could easily be a dozen different bird species in this habitat. It only shows a spider, some kind of crickets or bugs that live in the bark. There could easily be dozens of different species of insects in this forest, and several species of butterflies, and 5 different species of oaks and 2 species of maples. Again, a very simple version, but just to give you a sense on how complex or how more realistic when you start looking at the food web, showing you how all of the energy ultimately flows from the producers through the different levels of consumers. And again, the more diversity you have, the more plant life, the more sun, the more diverse the ecosystem can be, meaning the food web can get bigger and bigger and more complex. So typically the way that we show energy flow through an ecosystem is by showing some sort of what we call an ecological pyramid or an energy pyramid. And so it shows the relative amount of energy at each of the trophic levels. So the image on the right shows that basically we need 10,000 units of energy in producers, such as grass, to have enough food to feed 10 units or 10 mice. So it takes 10,000 individual grass plants to produce enough seed to feed 10 mice, and then those 10 mice are only enough food for one hawk, like this harrier or marsh hawk. So basically this is saying that in this ecosystem you can only have 3 trophic levels, because if there's only 1 unit of energy left as a bird of prey, a hawk, how could any other predator live on eating only hawks? So again, however much producer there is in the environment is going to dictate how many other consumer levels there can be. And again, in this case, for every 1 bird of prey, it ultimately takes 10,000 units of grass or energy to produce enough food ultimately for that hawk to survive. So again, these pyramids are basically illustrating how energy moves from one level, one trophic level to the next. And it gives you a sense of how much can be supported, or conversely, how much producer it takes to support one top level consumer, like in this case the hawk. So the ecosystem productivity can tell us a lot about the complexity or diversity of an ecosystem. We measure this by looking at what's called gross primary productivity, which is the rate at which energy is captured via photosynthesis. Again, it all has to start with photosynthesis, since that's how the energy gets from the sun to food energy here on the earth. So that's the total rate that energy is captured. But what's probably more useful to us is the net primary productivity, which is the actual amount of biomass that's found in excess of what's broken down by the plant for its survival. So it's expressed as grams of dry matter per square meter per year for a given ecosystem. So for every square meter of space there is in an ecosystem, we can measure how many grams of vegetation there are, which is what the dry matter is. And then based on that, we can start predicting how many other trophic levels, how many primary and secondary or tertiary consumers there could be given that amount of food. So again, the gross primary production is like your paycheck before any taxes were taken out. We have all of the sun's energy that makes it to the earth, but only a certain portion of it is actually captured by the plants and available to the next trophic level. Again, if you think about a shrub, deer around Northern California like eating a plant called buckbrush. Deer around here, the black-tailed deer eat the leaves of the buckbrush. They don't eat the bark, they don't eat the woody stems, they don't eat the roots. So the net primary production is really for, if we're looking at food for deer, they only eat the leaves. So not only are the deer losing energy after they eat the plant through just heat, but not the whole plant is even food for the deer. Other things might eat other parts of the plant. but the deer is only eating the leaves, and it's not going to eat the rest of the plant. So again, that's the difference between gross primary production, all the sun's energy that's reaching the earth, versus what is actually available for the first level consumers. Again, your gross pay is not what you take home. Some of that gets taxed, or Social Security, or whatever else you might have deducted. So you can't spend your gross pay, you can only spend your net pay. So we know that energy flows through an ecosystem. It goes one direction, from the sun, through the plants, through all the different consumer levels, out as heat or dispersed energy. Compare that to nutrients, or in general, matter in the environment. So that dead deer that just died over winter from old age, that matter is potential energy, and it's used by, again, a variety of animals and decomposers. And so that energy that's in the tissue of that animal is cycled. It's recycled and used over and over and over again. So there are things called biogeochemical cycles, which basically describe how material, the matter that organisms are composed of, is moved around in circles throughout the environment. So these biogeochemical processes involve, as you could guess by looking at the word, biological processes, geological processes, as well as chemical processes. And we as humans have a huge influence on these processes, how quickly they flow. In some cases, we may even disrupt the flow or cycling of these nutrients. So again, key concept about biology or ecology. Matter is always cycling through an environment. It goes from the abiotic environment, the minerals and elements that plants and we ingest, through living things and back to the environment to be reused again. Whereas the energy that is captured from the sun and moves through the environment is one directional, from the producers to the consumers, through the decomposers to heat. And that heat is so dispersed that it no longer has any ability to do work. So the first biogeochemical cycle that we'll talk a little about is the carbon cycle. Again, on this planet, the majority of life forms are carbon-based. So the global movement of carbon occurs between, again, the non-living part of the environment, the atmosphere, the ocean, and the living things. So the carbon flows between the non-living part of the environment and the living things in the environment. So the source of carbon for the carbon cycle is in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And basically that carbon flows from the atmosphere down here to the surface of the earth or to the ocean. It's used in the process of photosynthesis by plants, and then it's decomposed or given off in the process of cellular respiration. Respiration, when we think about that, it's simply what breathing in and breathing out. But with respect to individual organisms, it's really more of the process of how the cells in our body or in plants break down the elements. And so they basically combust the materials, and then ultimately when those living things die, the carbon is recycled again through the process of decomposition, and some of that is then given back off to the atmosphere, or if it's things in the ocean, it's given back off into the ocean, which still ultimately gets back to the atmosphere. So just think about a given human for a minute. What do we breathe in? Well, there's CO2 in the atmosphere, so obviously we're breathing in CO2, but we're using the oxygen from the atmosphere, and then our bodies are removing the oxygen and using all the energy we use, and when we exhale, we're giving off carbon dioxide. What do plants do? Well, they take in the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they break that element down combined with the sun's energy, and they give off oxygen. So the plants are giving off oxygen, the animals are breathing in the oxygen, giving off CO2. The plants are taking that CO2, again, breaking the elements down and creating food that basically we can consume. So carbon is an essential part of all living things. Again, we're carbon-based life forms, but it's also a very essential component in all the non-living parts of the environment. Carbon is one of the basic elements that forms so many of the compounds that we have in our environment. Sorry about that. It just seems like a slide might have gotten out of place here. So there's an image of the carbon cycle in your book. Again, it's kind of important to know where the source of the carbon comes from, which is the atmosphere. Plants, again, take in that CO2, convert it to a usable form of energy that plants can then be grown for our benefit to eat or for other animals to eat. Then that provides food for all the different trophic levels. And then when things die and they're decomposed, they give back off that carbon dioxide, or living things like us, humans, other animals, exhale carbon dioxide. The other reason that understanding the carbon cycle is so important is that all of those fossil fuels like coal and oil and natural gas are carbon compounds. They're basically the dead plants and dead animals from millions of years ago. As we mentioned in the beginning of this section, it's really about understanding the process, but also understanding how we have affected it. And so if we look at the arrows on this diagram, again, we see arrows going from the atmosphere, photosynthesis, plants, through different trophic levels. It shows the same process occurring in the ocean, and then those plants and animals, as they die, giving back the CO2 to the atmosphere, or through through animal respiration. You notice at the very bottom of the diagram where it shows coal, natural gas, oil, those are long-term reservoirs for carbon storage. So the atmosphere is a storage place or a source of the carbon, and the fossil fuels are long-term storage of carbon. So where we've kind of messed up this system is by imbalancing this cycle. Check the next slide here. Okay. So when we dig that coal and oil and natural gas out of long-term storage and burn it in our cars and give off the byproducts to the atmosphere, we're putting more carbon in the atmosphere than should be there when the carbon cycle is working properly. And so by burning fossil fuels that were meant to be long-term storage, we're throwing the carbon cycle out of balance. And when there's more CO2 in the atmosphere than there is stored on or under the surface of the Earth, we basically have more energy being stored in the atmosphere. So the sun's energy goes through the atmosphere, it bounces off the ground, or it re-radiates from the rock. And because there's more carbon dioxide in the way, that heat, that remember is the end of the energy flow, doesn't just leave and go out to space. It gets stuck in the atmosphere, making it warmer. And that's the whole concept of climate change or global warming that we'll talk more about later. So not only the fact that the carbon comes from the atmosphere and that it's meant to be stored long-term underground, but also that we are impacting the carbon cycle by throwing it out of balance through burning fossil fuels and then increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is, again, the primary reason for climate change. So the carbon cycle is obviously important. So is the hydrologic cycle, basically the water cycle. Water also circulates from the atmosphere to the land, to the oceans and lakes and rivers and streams, and then back up to the atmosphere. Again, kind of like with matter, or energy. It's never created or destroyed. There's really a set amount of water in the planet. It's all a matter of how much of it is in the atmosphere at a given time, or how much of it is on the surface of the earth in a frozen form, or how much of it's on the surface of the earth in a liquid form, or how much of it is underground in long-term storage. So again, we're not creating or destroying water. It's just a matter of where in the cycle it happens to be at a given time. And so this whole process basically creates a renewable supply of water for us here on the surface of the planet. When water molecules bump together in the atmosphere and get heavy enough to fall, they land on the surface of the earth as liquid, and then that liquid runs off into the lakes, streams, rivers, and oceans. Some of it percolates into the soil, where it either ends up in the lakes, streams, rivers, or oceans, or it ends up underground in aquifers, or the snow that falls to the surface of the earth can be a longer-term storage for water in the mountains or up in the north or far south part of the earth. And so basically it's the movement of that water from the atmosphere, the surface of the earth, back to the atmosphere. So we are certainly in California dependent on the runoff that we get from the snow in the high mountains as it melts in the springtime, and as that water runs off down into the streams and rivers and lakes and ocean. We've built dams to harness some of that for long-term storage, or we use it along the way as it flows towards the ocean. And so basically a watershed is an area of land where runoff occurs for a given area. So if you look around wherever you are now, if you see or you can trace the high spots around you, basically any drop of water that landed in that area would drain downwards into the nearest lake, stream, river, or some of that would percolate into the ground. The watersheds are kind of the definable unit that we use today when it comes to understanding water flow across the environment. And again, how do we impact the water cycle? Well, climate change, which is an impact of us messing with carbon balance, but also the chemicals that we have dumped into the atmosphere, aerosols, different types of pollutants, can actually weaken the carbon cycle. So the movement of water to the atmosphere may not occur at the same rate. If a given area is being affected by climate change and it's getting hotter, then that typically means more evaporation, less moisture. Now, we'll talk about this later, but climate change doesn't have to mean just hotter and drier. While some places will get hotter and drier due to climate change, other areas will get cooler and moister. So again, it's not that we're creating more water or that we're losing water, it's just getting redistributed. So those hotter, drier climates won't get as much rainfall possibly, or the mountains might be warm enough that they no longer hold snow for long-term storage. But then that water is still going to be up in the atmosphere or somewhere else that it'll fall to the ground. So again, we don't create or destroy it either. It's just a matter of how much of it's in the atmosphere and how much of it happens to be down on the surface of the earth. There are several elements that are important for life, basic elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So there are cycles that define all of those basic elements that are important for life. When you buy fertilizer for your garden, it typically has a 3-number ratio on it, the ratio of N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So nitrogen is a very essential component of proteins and nucleic acids. of which we and all living things are made up of. It's also important that it's a gas in the atmosphere that is about 78% of the composition of our atmosphere. I think most people think that the majority of the atmosphere must be oxygen. If it was, every time somebody went to light a fire, the earth would blow up. Oxygen is flammable. So the atmosphere is about 21% oxygen, but the bulk of it is nitrogen gas. So again, the source of nitrogen is in the atmosphere as a gas. The key thing is to understand the steps that it's necessary for it to get from a gas in the atmosphere to in the soil where animals, or I should say where plants, can take it into their roots to help them grow. And so basically this involves a process of nitrogen fixation, nitrification, assimilation, ammonification, and then denitrification. And those steps are all illustrated here on the figure. Atmospheric nitrogen is primarily fixed by certain types of plants on the surface of the earth and by certain types of bacteria that live in the soil on the roots of plants. The type of plant that are the nitrogen fixers are a family of plants we call legumes. So things like beans, peas, plants that are related to those types of plants. So alfalfa, the reason we plant alfalfa in a field is to get some nitrogen back in that field so that other plants will have the nitrogen to grow. So there are nitrogen fixers in the environment that serve that role. And again, then there are the bacteria that live on different plants that also serve that same role. The nitrogen in the atmosphere is in contact with the soil, since the air is in contact with the soil. And then those little bacteria on the roots of plants will actually take that nitrogen, just like the nitrogen fixing plants do, and basically nitrification is what occurs next, which creates the nitrogen that's tied to hydrogen molecules to form ammonia or ammonium, NH3, NH4. And so then those bacteria basically transform that into nitrates, NO3s. And then that NO3 is in a form that plants can now take it into their roots and use it for growth. Then there are denitrifying bacteria that are involved in the process of decomposition. So again, when a dead plant or a dead animal are decomposed, some of that nitrogen is denitrified and basically made into a gas again, where it circulates back to the atmosphere. Again, how do we affect this? Well, burning fossil fuels again gives off nitrogen, especially in combustion engines when you make heat. So automobiles give off nitrogen compounds. So again, you're taking elements that were stored underground long term and burning them and throwing them into the atmosphere at a higher rate than would naturally occur. Because naturally, obviously, there wouldn't be automobiles, there wouldn't be engines. So again, it's about us taking nitrogen out of long-term storage and putting more of it in the atmosphere. So with carbon, with nitrogen, the imbalance is always that there's more in the atmosphere than there should be. More of it should be stored underground, but it's not because we're digging it up and using it. So your book goes into a little bit more detail about these nitrogen fixing bacteria. And again, basically, all I care about is you understand that these bacteria are absolutely necessary for plant growth. Because again, plants need nitrogen to grow, one of the main elements they need to grow. And without nitrogen fixing bacteria on the root systems of peas or beans or other types of nitrogen fixers, nitrogen wouldn't be available for other plants. And when we start studying these things, even the effects of air pollution can get into the soil. Photochemical smog, that we'll talk more about later, and the effects of acid rain can be identified in nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. We can see the difference between healthy bacteria, the nodules, I should say, of bacteria, and they sort of get an almost bleached out look when they've been negatively impacted by these air pollutants. Sulfur is another important element. While there is sulfur in the atmosphere that gets there by burning things, the source of the sulfur is underground in rocks, as opposed to the carbon and nitrogen, which the source is in the atmosphere. So the decomposition of rocks basically creates the sulfur, which then is available in a variety of forms that actually can be used by plants. Sulfur oxides, the H2SO4s, sulfuric acid, and so forth. So the gaseous form of sulfur in the atmosphere is actually a very, very small, minor little portion of all the gas in the atmosphere. But the movement of it in the atmosphere and where it ends up is hugely important, because when sulfur gets in the atmosphere, it combines with hydrogen or oxygen, and that's where we get the sulfur oxides, and specifically sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid, it isn't super concentrated like you might have used in your chemistry lab, but it's more acidic than what is in the atmosphere normally. So when we burn things like coal, and the sulfur that's given off burning coal gets in the atmosphere and mixes with, again, the hydrogen and oxygen and forms sulfuric acid, then when it falls back to the earth in the rain or in other precipitation, it acidifies the environment that it falls into. So we have areas on the planet that are affected by acid rain where basically it has sterilized the environment. You get these lakes that look clean and clear, which looks good, but then you look for life and there's no life in those lakes. This acid rain has made the lakes so acidic that all the living things have died off. And the reason the lake's so clear is because it's even killed off the microorganisms and all the plants and potentially the bacteria and everything else. So you got nice clear water, but no life growing in there. So again, we primarily affect this process by burning coal. And then again, that in turn creates acid precipitation. The phosphorus cycle is the only cycle we've talked about so far that has no atmospheric component. It simply cycles through the soil, plant roots, animals, and back to the soil. So it's absorbed by plant roots in the soil. Again, it's necessary for the plant's survival, in this case, making nucleic acids and adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which is kind of the little energy source for our cells. So it stays pretty much tied to living things. It doesn't free flow through the atmosphere. The main challenge with this is phosphorus is a fertilizer, so it helps plants grow, which is good. But again, when we then take phosphorus and apply it excessively to agricultural fields, it runs off into the water and causes eutrophication, like we talked about a little bit earlier. So it over-fertilizes an ecosystem, and then you get a lot of the really bad things like algae that take over an aquatic environment to the point where all of the other living things don't have enough oxygen to survive because the algae is consuming it all. One of the reasons that we've gotten away from phosphate-based soaps, all of the soaps, cleaning soaps for clothes and that kind of thing used to be phosphate-based because it does a good job of breaking up dirt. But once we figured out how bad it was for the environment, we've moved towards more of these green products that we'll talk about later in the class. But things that are not phosphate-based, in other words, that are more biodegradable. All right, so now that we've talked about matter and energy and some of the important cycles in the environment, we'll get back to a few important definitions. So in order to understand populations and communities and ecosystems, we have to start by understanding the species, the individual species of plants and animals that live in these environments. And the way that we get at trying to understand those plants and animals is by studying their niche, or more generally, their ecological niche. Your book defines a niche as the totality of an organism's adaptations, its use of resources, and the lifestyle to which it's fitted. I kind of always like to think of it as, what job does something have? What role does it have? What job does it fulfill in an environment? Anything that describes where something lives, how it functions in the ecosystem, is going to describe its niche. It's the way of life for a given organism. And so as part of an organism's niche is the habitat, the place that it lives. The types of plants, the type of conditions that that plant or animal requires for its survival to meet all of its needs. So again, I think an easy way to think of a niche is to think of what job or what role does that living thing have in the environment. A vulture. Well, part of the role or job of that vulture is to clean up dead animals. If you had no vultures, no decomposers in an environment, things would die and they would just kind of stay there, which means then their nutrients wouldn't be recycled into the environment. So one of the vulture's roles is to start the process of decomposition, start breaking down the whole animal into parts, and then that kind of facilitates the process. So think of it this way. We can't ask an animal or a plant what its niche is, right? We can't say, hey, deer, as in black-tailed deer, write down everything about your life. Now, if I asked you to do that, could you do that? Could you describe your niche? How long would it take you to describe your niche? Remember, your niche is going to involve everything about you. So from the moment you were conceived, wherever you were conceived on this planet, wherever your mom was until you were born, all the people that you ever came in contact with, whether or not you knew them or saw them, driving down the road, the people that are passing you or going the other way on I-5 if you're driving to campus. Any one of those people could have a huge impact on your life. You know, somebody that falls asleep at the wheel and causes an accident that you either are involved in or that you have to slow down for. Your niche would involve all of your food items. What is your food habits? So again, that's not only what you've eaten till this point, but anything you might ever eat before you die. So I'm just trying to make the point that a niche is a very, very complex thing. And if we as humans probably couldn't quantify our own niche, we've probably forgotten more about our niche than we remember. To study the niche of a plant or an animal and just do that by watching it and recording things is still challenging. I mean, it's the best we got, but it's still a very difficult task to completely understand the niche of a living thing on this planet. We do our best. We look for the important things, the things that seem to be the most important for that organism's survival. And if we're trying to manage for that animal or plant, that's about all we can do. What does that thing need to survive? Is its common, most abundant food present? Is it lacking a nutrient in the soil? And that's probably about as good as we can do. So your book also talks about a fundamental niche versus the realized niche. The fundamental niche is the potential idealized niche of an animal or plant, whereas the realized is the actual niche. Again, based on how many different things are living in the same place you are, how many of those things you might be competing with for some of your basic needs. Those are all important aspects. So if we look at these two types of anole lizards in Florida, the green anole is native to Florida, and the brown anole was introduced, probably as people that had them as pets didn't want them anymore and let them go. Remember I said Florida, great climate for lots of things to live out in the wild. So the two fundamental niches of these lizards, when the brown anole was first introduced, overlapped with each other. They had a lot of things in common with each other. It could have been, the type of habitat they used. It could have been the type of food they preferred. Anything like that. The type of place they needed to be able to reproduce. So initially, that non-native species and the native species had a lot in common with each other. Their fundamental niches overlapped, like it shows under image C. But then over time, the brown anole, whether it's larger or a little more aggressive, actually outcompeted the green anole for some of the habitat requirements. So now we've gone from an overlap to basically the brown anole has everything it wants, and the green anole has less of something. Again, maybe it's a type of food that it no longer has access to. Maybe it's something about its habitat that it no longer has access to because of the brown anole. So the realized niche now is smaller than it was prior to the brown anole being introduced to Florida. And again, what are the components of those niches? Well, again, I mentioned some of the things that are involved in it, but we'll never know 100% of the things that affect the fundamental niche of any living thing on this planet. We just try, again, to identify the most important things to help that plant or animal survive. So going back in time, how did we determine some of these things about plants and animals? Well, the way that species generally try to avoid or minimize the amount of overlap that a niche has is by partitioning out their resources. Now, again, in this case, I'm talking about native species, not a non-native being introduced. You have an example here that's often used in talking about resource partitioning. You've got 5 native warbler species that all live in the same general type of habitat, like a mixed conifer forest. They all eat small insects that live on trees. So how did these 5 warblers avoid or reduce the amount of overlap of their niches? Remember, that's important because if you're competing for resources, if you're 5 different warblers and you're all competing for the same resource, and if that resource is limited, meaning it's not completely unrestricted, there's not as much as everybody needs, then there's going to be competition, and that generally means that 1 or 2 species might win, and the other 2 or 3 or 4 species might all go extinct. So it's beneficial to living things to find ways of minimizing the amount of competition they have with each other. So what was determined about these warblers is that they evolved or adapted the use of this habitat for feeding based on different times of the day, or they might have placed their specific nests in different places, or they may have started evolving different preferences for where they went looking for food. So the example here shows a given tree and the 5 warblers with respect to the areas that they forage for their food items, the little tiny bugs that live on the stems and needles of these trees. So the brown areas aren't dead patches in the tree. They're illustrating where these different warblers tend to focus their efforts. So to minimize competing with each other, and again, they're all warblers, they're related to each other, they're similar size, they have some similarities, just different colors. The yellow-rumped warbler tends to feed near the lower third of the tree. The bay-breasted kind of the upper third, but not necessarily the very top. Cape May warblers feed near the very tops of the trees. The Blackburnian warbler tends to stay near the outside of the tree, not interior towards the stem. And so over time, they evolved these different behaviors so that they weren't directly competing with each other for places to find food. And so this is called resource partitioning. We see this with similar species of birds. We see this with species of chipmunks that all live in a similar area. And again, we see this with a lot of different types of animals. They've evolved over time to minimize competition. And again, why is that important? Well, competition takes energy. If you're fighting each other for a limited amount of food or a limited amount of space, all of the effort of fighting each other off is a lot of energy that's just wasted energy. It takes away from the energy that's important for reproduction and keeping healthy. So avoiding competition is a good thing for plants and animals because it allows them all to be healthier. Probably in my estimation, one of the more interesting things about studying the environment is when you really start looking closely at how living things interact with each other. How birds interact with plants. In the case of this species on the image here, it's a bird that is adapted to getting the nectar or pollen out of a particular type of flower on a species of plant. Well, that's not just beneficial to the bird because it's getting food that it needs to survive, but how does that benefit the plant? Probably some of you know that flowers are the reproductive structures of plants, and so there's pollen in there, and by a bird sticking its beak in a bunch of different flowers in the course of feeding, it's also transferring the pollen from flower to flower or from one plant to another plant. Plants being the same species, of course. So it's actually helping facilitate the plant's reproduction by fertilizing the flowers that produce fruit that other animals may eat, or the fruit that has the seeds in it that will be the next generation of these plants. So little things like that, again, are the really most, in my mind, the most interesting part of studying the environment. There are so many incredible things out there. We just have to be thinking about looking for them, getting away from looking at the big picture to looking at the small little details that we might otherwise just kind of walk by and never pay attention to. So this type of interaction that we see here is called symbiosis. You have two species living in close proximity to each other, and both of them are benefited in some way. Now we'll get into specifics about where both are benefited or one is benefited and the other one is neutral. But basically it's a result of evolution. Two species co-evolving together. The honey creeper, the bird, has evolved this bill that's perfectly curved to fit the exact curvature of the flower on this particular plant. Again, lots of time, lots of random stuff, but basically two species evolving together in a way that they are very much now dependent on each other for their survival. So that's symbiosis. There are three types of symbiosis. Again, mutualism, where both organisms benefited, like the honey creeper we were just looking at. The bird benefits because it gets food. The flower benefits because it helps. The bird helps it reproduce. So that's mutualism. Another example of that could be this ant and the acacia that are on the slide here. The ant is able to get food and actually burrows into the hollow stems of this tree. And in turn, when other predators, other insect predators try and land on the tree to eat the leaves, the more predatory ants will actually attack and use those guys for food. Then there's a type of interaction called commensalism. This is where one of the species benefits and the other one has no positive or negative influence. So one organism depends on the other, but the dependence is kind of one way, but it doesn't hurt the other species either. And then there's parasitism, where one of the species actually benefits and the other one is harmed. So you think of parasites, you think of things like what? Mosquitoes could be, but leeches, fleas, ticks. They land on a mammal, they suck blood from that animal for their food, and that animal doesn't really benefit from losing its blood. Now, most parasites don't outright kill their host. Again, would it make sense from an evolutionary standpoint if the tick population got so bad that deer were literally covered every square millimeter with a tick to the point where the deer actually died from losing so much blood? Because then what does the tick do? If it totally kills its host, then eventually it's going to go extinct. So they may be harmed, they may be slightly weakened, but they don't usually kill their host. And usually the host is much, much larger than the parasite. So the host can stand the parasite being on it and still, the parasite getting some blood from it, but not resulting in actually killing that individual. Talk about the importance of these types of interactions with humans. We know that bees, native species of bees, are hugely important to humans because they are one of the very most important pollinators that we have. Butterflies, a lot of other insects, birds, even mammals will pollinate flowers. But bees are probably the most important pollinator. And not only for native plants, but also very much for our agricultural crops. I know folks that live, in the California Valley see bees at work all the time. You may not see them up close, but what happens in the spring when the plums or the olive trees or the other fruit trees start flowering? The guys and gals who have beehives are commissioned to place those around the environment, around the ag fields, and then those bees basically pollinate the flowers so that they produce fruit. In turn, of course, the bees use that to make their honey for their food. But without bees, there'd be so many crops around the world that just wouldn't grow. And actually, there are areas in the world, like it mentions here, China, where they have to be hand pollinated. Now imagine how tedious that is, to take little swabs and go from flower to flower, touching each of the flowers and basically hand fertilizing each of the flowers. Again, we have this colony collapse disorder that scientists are really, really concerned about. Believe it's the result of pesticides that weren't intended to kill the bees, but they're not selective, so they kill all kinds of different things. Diseases, parasites, viruses are also suspected as being some of the other reasons why we're having these big bee colonies declining. Then we also have problems with invasive species. The Africanized honeybees are much more aggressive, and they'll displace or kill native bees or the honeybees that we use to pollinate our crops. It could literally be something this small, like the collapse of bees, that has a huge impact on agriculture, which could ultimately have a huge impact on the worldwide economy. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of scientists trying to study this and come up with a solution. Some other really interesting interactions. Predation is an interaction among two living things. One is the consumer, the predator, one is the prey. And so these coevolutionary examples of what the book calls an arms race is, again, where you have predator species and prey species evolving together. The predators that evolve better adaptations, again, the cheetah being faster, better eyesight that allows it to catch a prey species, are going to benefit that predator. But on the other hand, the prey species are also evolving better eyesight, better escapability, better camouflage, so that they can avoid getting eaten. And so it's constantly this, again, as your book says, an arms race where the predators are evolving to be better predators, and the prey, though, are constantly evolving to be better prey species from an escapability standpoint. You've got examples like this goldenrod spider that basically uses camouflage. It, again, through a long period and some of that random mutations, evolved a more yellow coloring, so it blends into the flower that it's sitting on. When one of those bugs comes by the flower to pollinate it or to eat the flower or eat part of the plant, then basically it has the ability to ambush its prey species. Again, so much interesting stuff here that we don't have time for this class. I took a 2-unit class in college that was just on predator-prey interactions. And this is a lot of the kind of stuff we like to watch on the Discovery Channel. Animals, surviving, fighting for life. And it makes just for interesting stuff to watch. Another really important and interesting aspect of studying plants and animals is different sorts of social behaviors that plants or animals might have. When you have a colony of animals like these meerkats or animals that live in herds, you basically have this built-in behavior where you have a lot of different eyes because you live in a herd. And so at any given moment, if one animal has its head down, eating or drinking water, there are probably 10 others that have their heads up. And they're probably all looking in different directions. So it gets really hard for a predator to kind of sneak up on you if you've got 100 pairs of eyes looking in all directions. So again, there are animals that have evolved this social behavior sort of for the greater good of the entire population. They're sort of all looking out for each other. Plants and animals also have developed chemical warfare as a way to defend themselves. Poison glands in insects that make them taste bad, or that may actually be toxic to the animal that eats them. And then those animals learn that thing, don't eat it because it tastes bad. So usually in the environment, things that are brightly colored are usually telling everybody else, if you eat me, you're going to get sick. So those poison arrow frogs in South America, colorful fruits and berries, oftentimes natural colorful fruits and berries, or the really bright colored mushrooms are the ones you definitely don't want to mess with. But then there's also camouflage. This Indian leaf butterfly in the top image, I mean, yeah, it's darker than the green leaves, but it pretty much looks like a dead leaf, not a bug that might be food to a bird. Again, you start looking at all these really incredible things, just the diversity of behaviors, the diversity of adaptations that these animals have for living in their environments, the complex social interactions. Birds like crows and ravens and jays have a lot of social interaction with each other. Ravens and crows will get up in the morning and go and take a bath together. There'll be one that'll find a puddle of water or something, and it'll call the other ones to come over. So they have these kind of intentional interactions and are very intelligent birds. We talked earlier about the idea of avoiding competition, because again, there's always a downside if two things are fighting for survival. So again, competition is just some type of interaction among living things that are vying for the same resource, a limited resource like food or living space or nesting habitat. And there are two different types of competition: inter-specific competition and intra-specific competition. How to remember how to tell these apart? Well, what's the Highway 5 that runs north and south through California? It's Interstate 5, right? And where does Interstate 5 highway run? Is it just in California? No, it goes north into Oregon and Washington. So it's an interstate highway, meaning it goes through many states. So interspecific competition is competition among different species of animals. Intraspecific competition is competition within a species. So intraspecific competition could occur among a population of mule deer. They're all mule deer, but they're all fighting for food, especially, say, during the winter when there isn't as much food available. Out in the African savanna, you might have a lot of interspecific competition occurring because there are a bunch of different species of antelopes and gazelles and wildebeest. They're all different species, but they're still competing for a limited resource like food or water. So again, maybe use that analogy to remember which is competition among different species, inter, and which is competition among one species, intra. It's also important if we're studying an environment to identify if there are any keystone species present. So one example could be the gray wolf. It's a keystone species because it's crucial to the overall health and maintenance of the ecosystem that it lives in. Keystone species are not usually the most abundant animal in an ecosystem, but they could be. But whether there are a lot of them or just a few of them, the impact they have on the entire ecosystem is huge. So for example, the graph shows the correlation between the wolf population and the population of elk in a given area. Once the elk were reintroduced in 1995, the wolf population basically started increasing dramatically because now there was more food for it. But without the elk, or with too many elk in that ecosystem, what happened, and this is an example of, say, an area like Yellowstone, is when the wolves were shot to extinction, the elk population dramatically increased because they didn't have to be eaten by the wolf anymore. But then they needed to find enough food. So there was a lot of intraspecific competition among the individual elk to find enough food. And because the elk population was growing so rapidly, they were damaging the environment that they needed for survival. When the wolf was in that habitat, it kept the elk kind of in balance with the environment. So by simply the wolf not being in that habitat, the elk and other prey species populations start having a negative impact on their habitat by destroying vegetation. And what happened is, as the primary food like willows and poplars trees were declining because of the elk, other species like conifers were becoming more abundant. And so just there being no wolves in the population started changing everything about the plant community. So in this case, wolves are not the most abundant, but certainly a very important part of the ecosystem. Animals like beaver, the fact that they live in an environment, they create dams, which creates a more long-term water supply than a stream would normally be. So by beavers being in a habitat, they provide habitat for a lot of other animals that need water, maybe during the middle of summer when if it was just a stream, that water would not be available. But now that it's a little pond because of the beaver, the water is available. Or it could be one of the more abundant species in an environment like mice. How many different animals can you think of that could live in an ecosystem might eat mice? Dogs, cats, so I'm talking native animals like foxes, coyote, bobcats, even mountain lions will eat mice. So all of those kinds of animals. Most hawks and owls will eat mice. Any of the medium or larger size snakes would eat mice. So you can go on and name just a lot of different types of animals that depend on mice. So mice, or the lack of them in an ecosystem, could be very important with respect to the health of that overall ecosystem. All right, and then we're going to talk more about climate change later, but again, there's a case study at the end of this chapter talking about the effect of CO2 concentrations on climate change and relating that to sort of the future of our automobiles. How we're going to have to get away from burning fossil fuels to using other technology to power our vehicles and pretty much everything else that we depend on for our fuel.